evening, everyone, and welcome to The Knot. This is the Valley Youth Fiddlers year-end show. This performance will be just under 1 hour, and it'll be followed by a social gathering out in the round room, and we'd love to have you come join us. We'd also like to recognize that we are gathered here today on the unceded Williston clan territory of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and I'd like to introduce Chief Mabel Forsyth.
Good evening. My name is Mabel Forsyth, and my chief name is Timberwolf. And I'm from the Dimdan Children Nation, and this town sits on the Dimdan traditional territory called Gastiazoro, means Grizzly House. So on behalf of Gastiazoro, the Dimdan traditional territory, I would like to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mabel. Now, the Valley Youth Fiddlers have been fostering young and not so young musicians for 22 years here in the Valley, and all under the direction of Leslie Jean MacMillan. The artwork that you'll be seeing tonight on the back screen is by our local Facundo, Gastiazoro, and the story tonight is by Patrick Williston. Now, the music that ties this big knot all together has been arranged for us by some of Canada's leading fiddle players from across the country. You'll be hearing energetic dances from Sweden and some off-balanced tunes from Finland, a yak herding song from Mongolia, and even an intergalactic tune from outer space. So, thank you for coming. Thank you to all our generous sponsors who have made concerts and years of learning music like this possible. Before we start, we ask just to take note of the exits, and please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so yet. They do interfere with our wireless mic system. But most importantly, enjoy the show.
running about the yard for more than 1 hour, trying to keep a small kite in the sky on a windless day. And when she could run no more, the kite feathered to earth. She gathered up the string, which had become a wild tangle of loops and knots, and she cried. Her kite was ruined. "Let me take a look," said her grandfather. So she brought the kite to him and went inside to find something to eat. He sat on the porch with the kite and sighed, and then he began. He started with the end closest to the spool, carefully passing the spool through the loops that traced the path of the young girl's wild scampering around the yard. He smiled. It was well after the little girl had fallen asleep that the kite was untangled and made ready for another windless day. This became a recurring event, and both the girl and the grandfather found some pleasure in it. She began to bring her kite to school and would bring it home again in a terrible tangle. Her grandfather would chuckle, "Oh, this is a good one," and he would soon be busy following her schoolyard adventures, written in the knotted line. one day, she brought home a second kite. It belonged to her friend, and it too was a mass of twists and tangles. "It looks pretty bad," said the girl. "Do you think you can fix it? I told her that you would, that you can pretty much untangle anything." He replied. "I will try." It was very late when he had finished. In the string of the friend's kite, he had found a similar story as that of his granddaughter, though with its own pattern of skips and hops, its own accent, so to speak. Soon there were more kites and more knots, and the grandfather was kept very busy. It was about this time that a local journalist heard about this Mr. Fix-It, and wrote a little article for the newspaper with a photograph of the grandfather surrounded by dozens of brightly colored kites, well knotted. This is how he acquired the name, Mr. Fix-It. Now, Mr. Fix-It had a neighbor who was the sort that did not appreciate children, and felt strongly that all aspects of humanity should respect property lines, including sight and especially sound. He had a tall hedge, but not tall or wide enough to dampen the shrieks of joy and sorrow that burst like fireworks from the adjacent yard of Mr. Fix-It. More and more children were bringing their kites for untangling, often retangling them right there on the spot. The neighbor, old Joe, was short-tempered and a jangle of nerves. "I will teach that fool," thought old Joe, and he set about tying a terrible knot. He bought a large spool of fine twine and spent the whole day knotting it as tightly as he could, quietly chuckling to himself as he went. Then he bought a small blue kite, tied it to his twine, and called to a small boy who he saw walking down the sidewalk. "Come here, kid. If you take this kite to the famous Mr. Fix-It, you can keep it." He shoved the kite in the boy's hands and quickly disappeared into his house. The boy looked at the kite. It was in perfect shape and appeared as though it had never been flown, which of course it hadn't. But it was attached to an endless bundle of tiny knots, tightened into angry little fists. He briefly considered cutting the string, but he didn't have the money for a new one, so he shrugged and brought the kite over to Mr. Fix-It. The granddaughter saw it first. She could tell right away that this was not a tangle made by kite flying. No amount of running around would produce such a mean cluster of knots. She snatched the kite from the boy, enraged that someone would take advantage of her grandfather, and marched towards the garbage bin. Wait 1 minute," said the grandfather, sitting at his table on the porch surrounded by kites and strings. "Just let me take a look." She reluctantly brought him the kite. Right away he could see that this was not the work of a child. The knots were too tight and too deliberate for little hands. Who had made this, and why? The only way to find out was to untie it. Perhaps then he would understand what was meant by this trick. Mr. Fix-It finished untying the last kite string at his table, and then set to work on the blue kite, which he could also see had never flown. He did not make much progress that evening, only untangling a few feet of the twine. His granddaughter was furious. "It's a trick," she fumed. "Someone did this on purpose and is trying to get the better of you. Just throw it out." She had an idea of who it might be, but she did not say. "Yes, you're probably right," he replied, and continued with the stubborn tangle. The granddaughter came each day after school to check on her grandfather, imploring him to throw out this terrible kite string. But she could also see that he was making slow and steady progress. After 1 week, he had untangled more than 20 feet. After several days, the grandfather had found that the tiny knots had a kind of pattern or rhythm, like the way an elastic band will double on itself when wound enough times. He could feel anger and anxiety in the twine, sadness and loneliness too, and it became clear to him who had tied it. Finally, after nearly 1 whole month, the string was untied, and Mr. Fix-It returned the kite to the boy who had long since forgotten about it. The boy ran past old Joe's house, the kite fluttering behind him. "Thanks for the kite," he yelled to the shadow behind the glass. Old Joe was beside himself with fury. His stomach churned. He didn't eat anything for several days. Sleep was nearly impossible. He paced the floor, seething with anger. Then he had an idea. The next day he bought 1,000 large spools of the thinnest kite string he could find. He brought them home and piled them on the living room floor. It would take him too long to knot this up on his own, so he found the boy once more and offered to employ him and 9 of his friends for as long as necessary to tie all of the twine into an enormous and impossible knot. It took a whole month of tying for old Joe and the 10 boys and girls who had arrived to help. Like a gossip of great aunts, they sat in the living room telling stories to one another while tying knot after knot. Their collected efforts gradually grew into a lumpy ball about 3 feet wide. Old Joe rolled the massive knot next door himself. It barely squished through his front door. "Pretty good at knots, hey?" he sneered. "Here's a little something for you." And he heaved the enormous knot onto the table. It shook the porch. Mr. Fix-It did not even look up from the string he had been working on. It belonged to a child who had stumbled over something, perhaps a log. He could see a tumble in the tangle. He murmured. "Looks difficult." Old Joe smiled and nearly skipped back to his house. He had never felt so pleased with himself. When the granddaughter arrived that afternoon and saw her grandfather sitting by the ball of twine, she burst into tears. "No, grandfather, please, don't try to do it. It's a heartless trick. Please, it's truly an impossible knot." "You're probably right," he replied, and set about finding the end of a piece of twine with which to start. Progress was very slow. After only 1 month, only a few feet of the first strand had been untangled. Once again, his granddaughter pleaded with him to stop, but he continued. He could tell that the loopy knot was tied by a young person, perhaps a girl who had been daydreaming about other things. The loops were irregular and not tied very carefully. What had this girl been thinking about, wondered Mr. Fix-It. He tried to remember his own youth. He remembered building forts in the bracken and the way the dried stems split and cut your fingers with their sharp edges. After 2 months, the untied strand was scarcely any longer. His granddaughter begged him, "Can't you see? It's impossible. You'll never live long enough to untie it." "You're probably right," he replied, and continued following the twists and loops made by the absent-minded girl. Once again, a rhythm had finally emerged in the twine, but it was a very long and complicated pattern, with little flourishes here and there, and it made Mr. Fix-It wonder if one day the girl who had tied the knots would become a jazz musician. At last, after nearly 1 year had passed, Mr. Fix-It had untied one string. "Okay, you've proven your point," said his granddaughter. "Now will you please let it go and move on?" "The girl who tied that string," he said, "quite talented when she put her mind to it." And he searched for the next string to untie. One day, old Joe dropped in. "Still at it, are you?" he scoffed. "Yes," replied Mr. Fix-It. "It's a big knot." He chuckled. "I heard that you freed one string," said old Joe. "That means you've only 999 to go. It's not looking good for you, with your age, I mean. There's no way you're going to finish. You might as well and give up." Yes, you're probably right, sighed Mr. Fix-It, and he returned to the second string and untwisted a double overhand knot, which was considerably easier than a single overhand knot, perhaps not apparent to the tyer who had used mainly doubles, unless, of course, the tyer had intended the string to be easy to untie. The second string was emerging relatively quickly and was mostly free after only 2 months. Old Joe sat down. "So, how does it work?" he asked quietly. "Oh, there are no tricks," Mr. Fix-It replied. "You simply start at one end and make your way to the other." Old Joe found a loose end and rolled it in his fingers. He held it close to his eye and could see that the first knot was just a series of loops, one inside the next like a daisy chain. It looked like the knot used to tie the feed bags at his brother's farm. He gave the string a gentle tug, and several loops shook loose. He stifled a surprised laugh. "It's not that hard," he thought to himself. And then the real knots began. They were not so very tight, but there was an endless coil of them. And after a few, he sighed and then stood up. "That's enough of that for one day, at least for me. Well, we'll see you tomorrow then." And he strode back to his house. The granddaughter saw him leaving. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked. "So it seems," said Mr. Fix-It with a slight smile. "I don't get it. Why would he want to work on a knot that he himself tied? Does that make any sense to you?" "Yes," he answered.